So now that we've covered the interface, let's actually make our first app. I'm over here on the developer.android.com/docs page, which has the documentation for basically everything Android and Android Studio related, including a bunch of guides. And if I go from the Overview tab to the Guides tab, and then I click on the Introduction, which will talk about how these guides work, and then move on to Build Your First App and the Overview, this is really what we're going to use for a lot of this class. We're going to be using these guides. There's just too much content to cover in the short amount of time that we have. So we have this guide here for our first app, which we've basically done a lot of this already. We're going to use some of this. I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next page. It talks about how to run it, how to build the user interface, and that's what we're going to do first. We're going to build a user interface. And what we're going to do is we're going to build kind of a different version of what they're making. They're making one that has multiple activities. We're going to build a simple input-output app that works just on one screen. So I'm going to hop over to our app. And right now we have a text view and we have a button. I'm going to just delete those two things. Grab both and hit delete, and they're gone. So from my palette, I'm going to drag in a text view. I'm going to drag in a button, a plain text box. Now, if I look closely here, I can see the difference between things that ask for inputs and things that don't. So this says AB text view, right? This is like a little preview. Notice it doesn't have an underline versus this AB, which does have an underline. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a button here. We're going to have a text box here where they're going to input their data, and then that is going to appear on this text view right here. So we've added these elements to our page, and we'll notice that they all have these little red exclamation points, which is say this view is not constrained. It only has design time positions, so it will jump to 0, 0 at runtime unless you add the constraints. Design time is what we're doing right now. If I run this, which I'll do right now, what I see is that all of these things are going to jump to the upper left-hand corner of the screen, or the 0, 0 corner of the screen. So notice all of our UI jumped to the corner of that screen. Let's go ahead and just stop this from running. So back in our app, we need to add constraints. What's happening here is that if we look at our XML file, we basically don't have anything telling us where these things are supposed to be located, just that those things exist. We have this button, we have this input box, and we have this text view. So we always have to use constraints, and this is very different from something like iOS that automatically adds constraints to everything by default. This does not. We need to do it in Android Studio. So the easiest way, right, is we find a location, and we simply add a vertical and a horizontal constraint to it, and we call that good. Now, that works if we're using the same device every time, but what we're going to find is if we switch devices, it's going to look dramatically different. So I'm going to add some constraints, and there's actually this great little Infer Constraints button. I'm going to click that and see what happens. Okay, it added a constraint on the left-hand side. It's saying be 37 units from the left, and added a constraint on the top saying be 44 units from the top bar. Let's click this one. It actually already inferred all of these, it looks like. This text view is being inferred, saying be a certain distance from this part of the name thing and this part. That's not going to be too useful. But if we view it in a different view, let's try a 6.3 inch. Okay, that's not bad. It actually does a pretty good job. Let's try a tablet. Okay, that's a little different, but it's not bad. So we can mess around with these different views and see how our different objects are going to react based on the size of the view. Let's run this again and just see what it looks like. Sometimes that inferred constraints works just fine, and this may be one of those cases. But if it doesn't, we want to manually add constraints to our different objects. Let's hop back. Looks like it ran just fine. Cool, we have a button. We have our name area where we can add some text. We have our text view. Cool, good to go. I'm going to just go ahead and stop that from running. So let's clear all those constraints, which is this button right here. And it's going to clear all of them in the current layout. So I'll say yes. So now these are all free floating again. So let's manually add our constraints. If I come over here in the attribute editor, we have the layout options, and there's lots of different things we can do in here, including add multiple different kinds of constraints. So this little plus here is going to add a connection of the object to its top neighbor, which is basically what it did before. And I could add one to its left neighbor. Let's say our text view wants to be centered, and we want it to be a certain distance from the bottom. I don't really care how far it is from the top. The name, I'm going to do top, and we'll do side and side. Let's say, oh, I decided actually this isn't a necessary constraint. I can simply click that X and it'll go away. So what we've constrained to this is that it's always going to stay in this corner. So this one will always be this far from the right-hand side and this far from the top, no matter the device size. Let's change the device size real quick. And you'll see that that's true. It always stays that far from the top and that far from the right. If I move to a large view like this, it's always going to be in that upper right corner. My text view is always going to be centered because I have these different constraints added, and my button is always going to be in the upper left. So this makes sense if you start to think about how you want these arranged and what is the critical location for them in my scene. This seems pretty complicated, and frankly it is. It's something that can be very difficult. That infer constraints works 90% of the time, so you might just want to stick to that until you get the hang of it. But regardless, we can add constraints dynamically here, or we can allow the infer to do some of the heavy lifting. I'm going to switch this back to our pixel 5" now. So we have our layout built, and what we're going to do now is make sure that this is accessible in the code. So all three of these things need to be accessible in different ways in our code. The text view, we're going to be grabbing data from and pushing data to. The text object here that we're actually working with, like inputting data with, we're going to be grabbing data from. And then the button, we're not going to be getting any data from this button. We're just going to be using this to trigger an event. So each of these needs to be named in some way. They need to have an ID. So if I select my text view, there's this ID over here. Text view 2, I'm going to call this main text. I'm going to call this one edited text. And I'm going to call my button main button. So all of these different things are connected now with these names. So these names are accessible in our code. We just have to make sure that they have those names.